Public school systems across the world seem to be becoming increasingly at odds with the church, especially in the West. This has caused the rise in homeschooling and private school options. Today, we're going to look at the idea of the public school system and how America and also the anti-church sentiment were part of the foundation of our Western public school system. This will be a two-part series. I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to our Church History Podcast. I'm your host, Laura Lee Siemens. Okay, to start today, I'm very excited to make an announcement. My book is officially on Amazon and ready for pre-order. It's going to be released on November 5th. This book starts where my first book left off. And my first book was, of course, called The Church is Born. And that ended with Constantine and Arius. And this book, we're starting off, we're going to be talking where we left off there. We're going to be talking about Constantine and Arius and the fights that were happening there. And then we're going to talk about some other key people like Gregory the Great, which is where we get our Gregorian chants from. We're going to talk about the gospel coming to Ireland and England. We're going to talk about the Crusades, the Inquisitions, and the discovery of the New World. We're also going to see how the church slowly became corrupted. And the second book ends just before the Reformation. And the book is called The Church is Corrupted. I'm going to put a link for the pre-order in the show notes. And if you're interested in getting this book, go ahead and pre-order because that actually helps the algorithm. All the pre-orders count as a November 5th order. So that makes the book move on the Amazon list. I'm going to be talking more about the book in a short mini episode I'm going to be releasing later this week. All right, let's get into our episode for today. Throughout church history, Christian families never gave the government the right to educate their children. Can you imagine the early church bringing their children to Caesar, dropping them off for the Roman government to teach them and be their caregivers for most of the day? It would never have been even dreamt of. We've covered church history from the time of Jesus Christ all the way until the 1800s. And throughout that time, children did receive an education. As we've told the stories you've heard in almost every episode about the schools, and this has been a regular part of each of our stories. Children were sent to schools mostly by families who could afford it, but the government did not run the schools. The church ran most of the schools. In medieval Europe, monasteries were the primary centers of learning, where monks worked not only to preserve ancient texts and books, but they also taught reading, writing, and religious doctrine. Schools were established to educate clergy, and over time, cathedral schools were funded to provide broader educational opportunities, often for sons of nobility. The church's influence expanded to the formations of universities of Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, and Harvard and Yale in America. These were church-sponsored and heavily focused on theology, philosophy, the liberal arts, but all through Christian lenses. The curriculum aimed at understanding the world through the framework of Christian doctrine. The Catholic Church in particular was really instrumental in establishing school systems throughout Europe. And in missionary territories, the Protestants promoted literacy to better understand the Bible and Christian teachings. Religious figures all the way back to Charlemagne in the 8th century promoted education as a tool to unify the Holy Roman Empire under Christian principles. Throughout all of these eras in church history, the church emphasized students' moral and spiritual foundations. Education was seen as a pathway to intellectual growth and personal sanctification. When the reformers arrived on the scene, Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin also advocated for widespread education. There was an emphasis on the importance of literacy so that individuals could read the Bible for themselves. This advocacy further deepened the church's historical role in education, setting the stage for broader educational reforms in the centuries to come. Let's look at America in the early years. The Old Deluder Satan Act of 1647 was a groundbreaking piece of legislation, and it was passed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Its purpose was to ensure that children were educated, particularly in reading and understanding the Bible. This act recognized that if you ignored the scriptures that would leave people vulnerable to deception and being manipulated by Satan, who was referred to as the old deluder. This act emphasized that education was about acquiring general knowledge and enabling children to access and understand the Bible, which was the key spiritual protection and growth. Now, under this law, every town with at least 50 households was required to appoint a teacher to instruct children in reading and writing. The grammar school was established in larger towns of 100 households or more. While the law made provisions for towns to hire teachers, it placed the responsibility for children's education squarely on the shoulders of the parents. Under this law, parents were expected to ensure their children learned to read so that they could study the Bible and defend themselves spiritually. The Old Deluder Satan Act set an important precedent for education in early America. It emphasized parental responsibility, biblical literacy, and community involvement to ensure every child could read. The act recognized the purpose of education was not just practical, but also spiritual, and it aimed to protect the community from deception through knowledge of Scripture. In early America, children typically learned to read at home with their parents. Beyond the home, there was a vibrant network of private academies, church schools, and schools run by various denominations. Many of these institutions offered financial support to cover tuition for children whose parents could not afford it. If you look back at the founding fathers in the 1770s, you will see the level of education was remarkable. I would suggest trying to read the Federalist paper, which was written for everyday citizens. This was something that your farmers, your shopkeepers, your blacksmiths would read. Today, it's uncommon to find anyone who can easily understand these writings, even if they're translated to modern English. Yet, at the time they were written, they were meant for the commoner. Every child was taught to read the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress. If you haven't read Pilgrim's Progress, it needs to go on your reading list. As the industrial age began, many low-income families sent their children to work in factories, and then schooling changed. Families were no longer teaching children in their homes. It was the church that saw this as a growing problem, and across England and America and Canada, Sunday schools were started. We've covered this in past episodes, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Sunday schools were not stories necessarily about the Bible. They were literally schools taught on Sundays for the children who were working during the week. Now, before we can get into the public school system, we have to look at the life of a man named Robert Owen. Robert Owen was an industrialist from Wales, and he became known for his attempt to create a utopian society in America. First, he transformed his cotton mills in Scotland into a humane management and educational model. Then, Owen grew delusioned with the harsh realities of the Industrial Revolution. He envisioned a new social order that would be built on communal property, equal rights, and universal education. In 1824, Owen considered America as the ideal blank slate for his vision. He purchased a town. It was called New Harmony, Indiana. Here, he hoped to create what would be called a new moral world. One of Owen's most controversial ideas was separating children from their parents to raise them in communal nurseries. He believed that if you removed children from their families, they could be raised in a more controlled environment, free from their parents' negative influences. However, this radical concept caused a lot of tension and unrest within the community. Many parents were obviously deeply uncomfortable about losing direct influence with their children's upbringing. Despite Owen's high hopes, New Harmony quickly descended into chaos. The town attracted a mix of idealists, but also freeloaders and troublemakers, leading to a constant internal conflict. There was overcrowding, there was housing shortages, and there was an external pressure from critics and hostile neighbors, and the whole situation was terrible. Owen struggled to balance his authority with his personal aspiration for the residents, and eventually it contributed to the downfall of the entire experiment. By 1827, the Utopia community began to collapse. There was so much financial difficulties, people started leaving in droves. Owen's grand vision for New Harmony completely fell apart, and the land was eventually returned to private use. Although the experiment failed drastically, Owen's ideas lived on, influencing future social movements. He remained committed to these social reforms all the way until he died in 1858. This was pre-communism, and perhaps some people could consider it the first trial of communism, and it failed. What does it have to do with public school? Well, before he passed, Owen wrote several essays, one of which a Prussian ambassador found and took with him back to Prussia. This idea inspired a revolutionary idea for education. It was a tool that Prussia could use to create obedient citizens. Prussia implemented the first modern government-run education system with children segregated by ages, handed over to the state, and taught strict obedience to authority. Though it was flawed, it became the foundation of the idea that government could and should control the education. This system was later brought back to America and was adapted by others who, just like Owen, rejected biblical teachings and viewed the world as a collectivism and anti-Christian. In our next episode, we're going to dive more into this Prussian school system, but it's important to remember that this happened. Now, let's look at a man named Horace Mann. Horace Mann was born into a poor family on May 4th in Franklin, Massachusetts. His early life was filled with hardship, and from age 10 to 20, he received no more than maybe 6 weeks of formal schooling each year. And despite this, Mann was determined to educate himself, and he took full advantage of this local Franklin Public Library, by the way, the first public library in America. In 1816, at age 20, Horace Mann was enrolled at Brown University. Remember, this was despite receiving only a limited formal education in his very early years. Horace Mann excelled academically. He had a passion for learning and self-improvement, and that drove him to succeed. Just 3 years later, in 1819, he graduated as a valedictorian. His commencement address focused on education and moral character, concepts that are going to shape his life's work. Now, you could think that, hey, he understood that doing most of his schooling at home, educating himself by reading in a library, he was successful. Perhaps the school system was working the way it was, but instead, he had other ideas. After he graduated, Horace Mann shifted his focus to law, and he began studying under a local lawyer. And by 1823, he was admitted to the Massachusetts bar, where he quickly established his legal practice. But his ambitions went way beyond the courtroom. In 1827, Horace Mann was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives, where he advocated for various social causes. He focused on public health, mental health, and the establishment of state-run insane asylums. Work that showcased his deep concern for society well-being. In 1830, Mann married someone named Charlotte, who was the daughter of a former Brown University president. However, tragedy struck when Charlotte passed away just 2 years into their marriage, leaving Horace Mann completely heartbroken. In his grief, he continued working in public service. By 1835, he was elected to the Massachusetts State Senate, where he continued his advocacy for mental health. But also, this is where he began taking on a new cause: public education reform. Horace expressed his desire to remove the Bible from public school, and this bothered Christians, all the different denominations. Horace expressed his desire to remove the Bible from public schools, and here was his argument. There are so many Christian denominations, it's so difficult to decide whose doctrines should be taught. So the solution? Let's just remove the Bible entirely. We'll let the church, each one, teach the Bible, and in school, we'll just teach education. This idea was radical, and it almost led to his downfall. However, he saw that it was radical, and so he began to navigate more carefully and talk about it a little bit less. Mann's efforts to reform the education led to an early infiltration of questionable practices and theories that are now part of our public school system. As the government began slowly taking control of education, Horace Mann introduced ideas that strayed far away from the Christian moral foundations that previously shaped schools in America. He laid a groundwork for a system that would gradually distance itself from any biblical principles. In 1837, Horace Mann was appointed as the very first secretary of the newly established Massachusetts State Board of Education. He left behind his successful law practice, and Horace Mann devoted himself entirely to the case of educational reform. He began visiting schools nationwide, keen to understand their conditions firsthand. He began writing annual reports, and he outlined his vision for a new, improved public education system that would shape future generations' minds and character. In 1838, Horace Mann took his mission one step farther by founding and editing the Common School Journal. This was a publication that became the voice for all of his ideas and reforms. Through this journal, Horace Mann emphasized the importance of non-sectarian public schools, proper teacher training, and a well-rounded curriculum that would include moral education. His vision for public school education was revolutionary for his time. Here are the 6 principles he had. 1. The public must no longer remain ignorant. 2. Education should be paid for, controlled, and sustained by an engaged public. 3. Schools should embrace children from all backgrounds and provide equal opportunity. 4. Education must be non-sectarian. 5. Schools should teach the principles of a free society. And 6. Well-trained professional teachers should deliver education. Now, Horace Mann wanted to learn from other educational systems, so he traveled to Europe in 1843 at his own expense. He studied schools in various countries, especially Prussia. And his 7th annual report, written after his return, detailed his findings and sparked widespread interest, not just in Massachusetts, but across all of the United States and even all the way to England. Horace Mann believed that education could become the great equalizer by bringing children from all social classes together in a common learning environment. He argued that schools could help the less fortunate advance in society and serve as a place where moral values such as discipline and obedience to authority were taught right alongside reading, writing, and arithmetic. These principles, he believed, would help prepare students for future employment and install in them the values needed for success in life. Now, right away, Horace Mann faced resistance from parents and the church. Families and the church were uncomfortable with handing over moral education to teachers and bureaucrats. The church in particular objected to the fact that they would be teaching morals while excluding any religious instruction. Horace Mann continued, and he started something called Normal School, which trained teachers. Now, the government was training each of the teachers to teach the way they wanted them to be taught, so that the schools would only teach what the government wanted the children to learn. There was a lot of opposition, but Horace Mann's work did revolutionize the public school system in Massachusetts, and his influence spread to other states. His ideas were met with criticism, especially from Boston. The schoolmasters there very much did not like his so-called innovative methods. But it was his ideas of education that eventually laid the foundations for the modern American public school system and also for the Western public school systems in general. In 1843, Horace Mann married Mary Tyler Peabody, and this marked a new chapter in his personal and his professional life. The couple went to Europe on their honeymoon, and here Horace Mann embarked on a mission to once again study educational systems. And once again, he went back to Prussia, and he really found he loved the Prussian model. Remember, the Prussian education model was actually started by Owen in America when he tried to create a utopian society. This trip greatly influenced his ideas, and when he came back to the United States, he was ready to reform the education system. The couple eventually had sons, Horace Mann Jr., George, and Benjamin. Horace Mann was so deeply impressed by the Prussian education system, which emphasized centralized control, professional teaching training, and a structured curriculum. His observations fueled his passion for education reform, and he began pushing this same model in Massachusetts. As the secretary of the Massachusetts School Board of Education, Horace Mann dedicated himself to the idea that education should be non-sectarian, publicly funded, and access to all children regardless of their background. And he thought public education would teach people civic virtue, social reforms, and moral character without using the Bible or religion. And therefore, you could shape future generations to be disciplined, responsible citizens that didn't rely on the Bible. One of Horace Mann's key innovators was the introduction of age-graded classrooms. Now, before this, schools would group children of a lot of different ages, and students progressed at different rates. When he organized children into grades based on age, he created a more structured system where students could move through a curriculum collectively. This was known as the factory model of education, and it spread across the United States. Also, his normal schools for training professional teachers also began to be used across not only the United States, but Western Europe. And through all of this, there was still so much opposition. Parents resisted his ideas. They really did not like giving teachers and bureaucrats control over their moral education. Churches criticized his insistence on keeping schools non-sectarian and keeping any mention of the church or the Bible out of the schools. Other people objected to the idea of some of his methods that were creeping into the system. One of his methods was known as a whole word method for teaching reading. Instead of teaching the sounds of letters, he wanted his students to memorize words and what those words were, and just memorize that as a way of teaching reading. Thankfully, people pushed back on that enough that didn't go through. In 1848, Horace Mann resigned from the Board of Education because he was ready to run for a seat in the United States House of Representatives, and he won the election. So he shifted his focus to national issues. He was very strong in the anti-slavery stance, and he believed education was going to shape society, and it could be used to fight against slavery. Horace Mann's commitment to public service and social reform remained steadfast throughout his whole life, but his biggest part was shaping the nation's educational system, and with a moral conscience that did not use the Bible or the church. In 1853, Horace Mann became the first president of Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and he had this job until his death. Here, he continued his crusade for equality, promoting co-education, and admitted students regardless of race or gender. On August the 2nd, he passed away at the age of 63 in the year 1859. He became known as the father of American public education. What were his ideas of the neutral public school? Well, one of these key ideas of the neutral public education, he believed public schools were not meant to be theological seminaries. In his view, schools should avoid teaching any specific beliefs in any religion. When people would say that he was making schools anti-religion, he said no, he wanted to teach Christian morals. He just didn't want to use the Bible to do that. He saw public schools as an institution to promote good behavior and to prevent crime. The next question to ask, are public schools anti-Christian? Horace Mann said that the public school system should not be anti-Christian. However, he did believe that the Bible should be read in the public school system as a book. It just shouldn't be the key part of the moral teaching. However, in 1963, in America, the Supreme Court banned Bible reading in the public schools. This made it impossible to claim that public schools still taught Christian values. What was the main problem that Horace Mann saw with this system? Well, Mann recognized a significant problem: funding public schools through taxes. He acknowledged that forcing people to pay for school that might teach ideas that they found false or harmful was actually wrong. He didn't agree with that. And he warned it could lead to tyrannical consequences, as it would force citizens to support beliefs they didn't agree with. Now, his idea was that many of the schools at that time were teaching Christian morals. And he thought, what if somebody wasn't Christian, they didn't believe in the Christian morals, and now their tax dollars were being used to support and pay for something they didn't believe with? And ironically, his words could be used to criticize the current public school system as tyrannical. because it forces people to support an institution that promotes a secular worldview that's at odds with their faith. Now, Horace Mann was, like I said, the father of the public school system, but it is the next story we're going to talk about with a man named Dewey and how the Prussian system influenced Dewey as well as it had influenced Horace, and how under Dewey, who really loved communism, the public school system took a very dark turn. And we're going to talk about him in our next episode. So tune in to hear that next week. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. We release new content every Monday. And don't forget to check out our website at lauraleesiemens.com for more information and additional resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week as we continue our journey through the incredible history of the church.